Go ahead, Jaita.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. This is Joita Devdhar, and welcome to this lecture series of Dr. Roop Gursahani. And we've planned a few. This is the second one that we are doing today. Of course, I wasn't there the last time, and this is a series of 4 lectures that Roop has planned now. For those who don't know Roop, which is not possible because all of you are there on this webinar, he is a consultant neurologist in PD, Hinduja National Hospital, and he is one fellow palliative care aficionado, especially palliative care in neurology. And I had initially asked him to take a few classes for our TMH students, and then Savita and Gayatri and other people also had approached him, and so he has combined us all into this teaching series for 4 weeks. And with no other time wasted, over to you, Roop.
Thank you, Joyita. I mean, thanks for that initial push from you and Gayatri. And then, of course, as it went on, I realized it was good for me also to put my own thoughts in order. So, last time, I did make this small bit of comment about why palliative care physicians need to learn neurology. And the essential issue is that as palliative care goes forward into non-oncology PC, you will realize that a lot of your work is going to be neurological. And unlike oncology, where you have finite commitments, finite prognosis, very often neurology, the commitment and the prognosis are not so well defined. And that is a challenge, but equally so, it's an opportunity. And I realized that when I did rounds with Anil once, this was last year, and we realized that there is a lot of neurology in the community palliative care needs. Now, one thing that we don't realize is that neurodegeneration is probably the last frontier of medicine. Although our bodies live longer, we still haven't found effective ways of helping minds live longer. So that hospitals, medical systems are struggling to cope with age-related neurodegenerative illnesses, and so too are social care professionals. And obviously the relatives of those patients who have neurodegenerative diseases are the worst hit. There are multiple mechanisms that are relevant. Last time we spoke about motor neuron disease, where the mechanism is excitotoxicity. But today, the mechanism that we are going to be discussing has mainly elements of protein aggregation, though people have also spoken of inflammation and mitochondrial dysfunction in Parkinson's disease. And there are some kinds of inherited Parkinson's disease where iron accumulation is the mechanism. So if you look at the broad spectrum of neurodegenerative disease, let's start with Alzheimer's disease. That primarily affects the brain, and it usually starts off in the temporoparietal areas with atrophy, and it has a very clear microscopic signature, that is the plaque of amyloid. As compared to Parkinsonism, which starts off in the midbrain, but then also ascends through the rest of the brain, it starts off with accumulation of Lewy bodies in the substantia nigra, part of the basal ganglia system. We spoke last time about ALS. Then less commonly you have Huntington's disease, but for those of you who are not aware, we do diagnose Huntington's disease fairly, I wouldn't say frequently, but definitely we do diagnose it in India too. Lewy body disease is another disorder that non-neurologists are not often aware of. And it's important because even at the late stages, this is one of those conditions that does have some therapeutic benefits, and it overlaps with Parkinsonism. Now, how big a problem is Parkinsonism? Well, it's obviously an age-linked issue, and sorry, can I? Yeah, sorry. Yeah, the laser pointer is working. Yeah. It is a disorder that begins largely after the age of 60, and about 1 to 2% of people over the age of 65 will get it. It's a significant cause of death, and one of the reasons why it is not as high as people think it is because very often, and I'll explain this a little later, uh, it's like dementia. It is not often put down as a cause of death. Out of those who develop Parkinson's, the vast majority, 75 to 80% of those who survive long enough uh, after the age of, say, into the second decade of the illness will develop dementia. And a large number of them will have non-motor symptoms. Now, I'll explain that again. Non-motor symptoms are due to involvement of other parts of the brain other than just the basal ganglia. And as you can expect, these are all patients who, because of lack of recognition of palliative care needs, end up with hospital deaths and poor hospice use, added to by the fact in India that we really don't have any hospice services for non-oncology. Again, a little bit of neuroscience here, and this is something that is important for you as not just as palliative care physicians, but also as medical professionals. What we've begun to realize is that neurons, please remember that the neurons that you're born with are the neurons that you're going to die with. So unlike, say, cells of the skin or of the liver or wherever the cell itself gets replaced, the neuron has very, very sophisticated mechanisms for, the simplest word is junk disposal. And if you look at proteins, proteins that are required for the infrastructure of the cell, for the cytoskeleton, and so on, these proteins, as they are generated, they undergo a process of correction through something called the chaperone system. And if that does not work, then the chaperone system actually puts these proteins through the proteasome where they get effectively junked. And this is done by a process of ligation with ubiquitin. And it is when this fails, and of course there are genetic mechanisms as well as environmental mechanisms to it, when it fails, depending on the exact version that predominates in that individual, you can either have the accumulation of the fragments that produce the Lewy body, as opposed to the a very rare entity called the Parkin gene, where you get Parkin protein. Now, across these disorders, especially in the movement disorders, these defective proteins, which accumulate because their disposal is not adequate, or also some because the generation of abnormal proteins is higher, produce neurodegeneration because the protein function is lost. That mutant protein inhibits the wild type protein. It causes apoptosis or degeneration of neurons, and so on. And depending on the exact protein that is seen, alpha-synuclein underlies Parkinson's disease, diffuse Lewy body disease, and multiple system atrophy. Then another protein called tau, and in this we have 3 and 4 repeat taus. The 4 repeat taus is a group of disorders including progressive supranuclear palsy and corticobasal degeneration. These are 2 major ones. And then there are polyglutamine proteins, in which Huntington's disease and spinocerebellar ataxias are the most common. Huntington's disease has significant palliative care needs, but it's a fairly small component. And again, because mode of death is usually through dementia, I'll not be covering it this time. It will come up more next time. So the Parkinsonian disorders. Now, Parkinsonism can also be secondary. And the most common cause of secondary Parkinsonism is drug-induced neuroleptics. People who are on long-term neuroleptics can end up developing gradual problems with movement. And very often these are recognized by psychiatrists and the drugs are reduced or stopped, and a fair number of patients do reasonably well. And then, of course, you have the neurodegenerative ones. In this, you have two major groups. Now, when we refer to idiopathic Parkinson's disease, that is the classic Parkinson's, it is very rarely familiar, maybe to the order of about 5%, and most cases are sporadic. The generation, of course, there is an element of genetic risk even in the sporadic cases, but the bulk of the causation is supposed to be environmental. And this is classic Parkinsonism that we recognize. But starting, say, almost about 5 decades ago, it began to be realized that there were patients who had features of Parkinson's which were different. They are called the atypical Parkinsonian disorders, or in neurology, we call them the Park plus syndromes. Most of them tend to be sporadic, though there is an overlap with the familial entity in frontotemporal dementia. And these are 4 clear entities. Dementia with Lewy bodies overlaps best with Parkinson's disease. It's something of an overlap between Alzheimer's disease and Parkinsonism, and we'll discuss it a little later. Progressive supranuclear palsy is again an entity which starts off in the midbrain and produces a lot of changes. I think I have a slide which tells you the clinical details. Corticobasal degeneration is degeneration of one side of the brain. Multiple system atrophy has largely autonomic deficiencies. But idiopathic Parkinson's disease constitutes almost 80% of the cases that we see. And very often, even the other types, the MSA, the CVD, the PSP, when they start off, can often mimic idiopathic Parkinson's disease. So, an alert neurologist should be able to pick up that these are perhaps different. This picture is almost, I think, more than 100 years old, drawn by Sir William Gowers. And it shows a mid-stage Parkinsonian patient at that stage. Now, when Parkinson's begins, the 2 cardinal features are tremor at rest. Tremor can be of 3 types. In an outstretched hand, it can be on intention, and it can be at rest. It's the rest tremor that marks out Parkinsonism. It's not a very fast tremor, it's a slow tremor, and it's although it's something that patients do get bothered about, it in fact is not something that causes too much disability. What causes disability is the bradykinesia, the slowness of movement. And this bradykinesia affects everything. It affects movements in the limbs. It affects facial expression. So we call that hypomimia. It in fact even affects thinking to some extent. Then comes rigidity. And rigidity is something that is a clinical finding. It's examined. So if you see a neurologist, the typical way that one would do it is to rotate at the wrist, and with that you assess rigidity. There's a resource that I have listed right at the end, which will actually show you the signs, and I think it is important for palliative care clinicians to be aware of these findings. And loss of postural reflexes. Now, loss of postural reflexes is important because it correlates with falls, and it is significant for morbidity. In fact, it's also a marker for increased mortality. How do we assess it? Again, you'll see it in the videos that I've attached at the end. They are on from YouTube, so you should be able to access them. We do something called the pull test. So I would make the patient stand in front of me, with me standing with my back to some kind of a support, either my couch or the wall, so that when I pull the patient back, and this is a sharp tug, most of us would, even if you're surprised, we'll be able to hold on. And these are patients who are warned that they're going to be pulled in this fashion. So typically, as long as they are intact, they will take 2 or 3 steps and stop. But once they start losing their postural reflexes, you'll see this man go back like a log of wood on you. Then come freezing, and freezing is in fact, it can be very troublesome for patients because it also doesn't respond very well to medications. And in freezing, the patient, while walking, suddenly stops. He can speak, and it takes him some time of some shuffling and so on before he can start moving again. And the flexed posture. So these are the 6 cardinal features, but I've added one more, and that is a response to levodopa. It comes up in some diagnostic criteria, but usually not. We call it definite Parkinson's disease if there are at least 2 of these 6 features, of which at least one should be either tremor or bradykinesia. Probable if there's only rest tremor or bradykinesia, and possible if it is only 2 out of these 4, 2 or more out of these 4: rigidity, loss of postural reflexes, freezing, and a flexed posture. So the important thing to understand is that Parkinsonism is overall a clinical diagnosis. And since it is a clinical diagnosis, this is something that it comes up repeatedly in neurologic illnesses where you don't have a clear-cut, what we would call a biomarker, which, I mean, something that patients can see. And depending on how the diagnosis is conveyed to the patient, in a situation where you don't have a scan or something that lists it out, it's the clinician's responsibility to convey the diagnosis with sensitivity, but also with clarity. Because otherwise, especially when in those patients who don't have very clear-cut syndromes at the beginning, diagnostic confusion at the beginning, impairs the therapeutic relationship for a long time. Okay, so now what happens once somebody has Parkinson's disease? Can you identify it before it starts, when even a neurologist can't pick it up? Yes. So these are normal and abnormal DAT scan, dopamine transporter scans. In a normal scan, this is picked up, the tracer is picked up in the basal ganglia. These are the caudate nucleus and the putamen, and you can see they're nice and bright. And in this patient, it's already significantly less. Both the caudates are smaller, and the putamen is actually quite dim on the right side. So this is a patient who, if there was nothing clinically found, we would probably label as stage 0. And this, the Hoehn and Yahr staging for Parkinson's disease. Hello? Yeah, somebody needs to... hello? Yeah. Okay. So when it begins unilaterally, asymmetrically. This is very typical of idiopathic Parkinson's disease. So bilateral disease right from the beginning is one of the markers that this might be one of the Parkinson's plus syndromes. And as it goes on, axial involvement also appears. Now, axial involvement is a little tricky to judge. This will typically happen because you will see a little bit of rigidity in the whole body. So you see a patient walk away from you, turn and come back. Now, if you look at any of us, as you walk, as you turn, when you turn, different parts of your body don't turn at the same time. Your head probably turns a little far, and you are a little flexible as you turn. These patients turn en bloc. The whole body turns as one unit. Then, of course, signs appear on the other side. So this is bilateral disease. but balance is not impaired. The next is when there is mild bilateral disease, but the pull test is still recovering. I mean, the patient takes 2-3 steps back and then stands up. When the patient no longer can compensate for the pull test, that is when this has reached stage 3. And this then goes on to, I mean, this is a patient who's still physically independent. Then, of course, disability increases, but the patient is still able to walk or stand unassisted in stage 4. And by stage 5, the patient is wheelchair bound or bedridden unless aided. And we'll discuss about how, what durations it takes to. You can see this diagram. This is a man who's walking well, except that there is arm swing on this side and not on this. And here, both sides, arm swing has been lost as you walk. That's something that even patients notice. And then the stoop begins together with the loss of the writing reflex. Right. Now, you would think that Parkinson's disease is entirely motor, and you would be quite wrong, because there's a huge quantity of non-motor involvement in Parkinson's disease. Now, I didn't want to bore you with too much of neurology, but one of the things that is now being recognized is that Parkinsonism probably starts off in the gut. Yes. So the enteral nervous system, there's a whole bunch of neurons in the gut. It probably starts off from there, and by a kind of a prion mechanism. A prion is something that is even smaller than a virus, where abnormal proteins kind of transmit from neuron to neuron, literally in an inanimate fashion, and kind of transmit up through the nervous system. How has this been shown? It came up because somebody noticed that individuals who'd had vagotomy for peptic ulcer in the 30s, and now that's a treatment that stopped a long time ago, actually had a lower incidence of Parkinson's disease. And now there is enough evidence that this starts off from the microbiome in the gut. And from there, the disorder spreads up into the brainstem, through the midbrain, and then actually starts to affect neurons all the way up. And as you can understand, obviously, then it is much more than just the basal ganglia. It is all these other things. Now, as it affects the midbrain reticular system and the autonomic nuclei, you get orthostatic hypotension, obviously erectile dysfunction, excessive sweating, and overactive bladder. And then, of course, drooling. You will see Parkinson's patients have a lot of drooling issues. And we've covered the management of drooling last time in motor neuron disease. Just a quick word that one of the simplest things to, I mean, you use anticholinergics, but one of the simplest things to use is for immediate control is atropine eye drops. One drop in the mouth will keep a patient dry, his mouth dry for at least about 4 to 6 hours. Gastrointestinal, constipation, gastroparesis, eventually small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Now, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth is because constipation goes to obstipation, and these patients need very careful monitoring of their bowel functions. They may not respond to your standard laxatives, and they require polyethylene glycol on a regular basis to prevent them from going into obstipation and then into small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, which eventually goes on to become a malabsorption. I'm going to discuss this a little more in terms of the pain. There is pain related to PD and not related, but two other entities that are quite interesting are nocturnal leg cramps. Now, all of us get leg cramps, but for some reason, these become more frequent in Parkinson's, and the management is basically passive stretching. Restless leg syndrome is an overlap disorder which comes up without Parkinsonism also. It can be inherited separately. It responds to uh, 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 some of the, I mean, it responds to the drugs that are used for Parkinson's. And it's a very odd syndrome. So I would be surprised if some of you hear this and identify it in one of your relatives or so on. It's quite underdiagnosed. This is a person who at night can't get to sleep because the legs have a lot of sensory symptoms and they need to keep moving, rubbing their legs. Maybe some of them even need to get up and walk a little before they finally find sleep. If you have had an elderly relative who needs to have his or her legs pressed at night, you might make this diagnosis. Sensory, hyposmia. Long before COVID started to affect people's uh, sense of smell, it was Parkinson's that did it. And this can come up years before uh, the other symptoms come up. Skin abnormalities, seborrheic dermatitis, sleep disturbance, REM behavior disorder. Now, REM behavior disorder is pretty unusual. Again, this is a pre-symptomatic feature. So this can come up years before the Parkinson's becomes manifest. And this is interesting. These are people who act out their dreams. Now, why does this happen? This happens because we have a kind of a switch in the brainstem, which switches off the body when we dream. So that although you may be running, chasing, doing all kinds of things in your dreams, you actually are lying there quietly. All that shows up is your eye movements. And if that switch is defective, you actually start acting out those dreams. Impaired sleep onset and maintenance, excessive daytime sleepiness, this you can understand. Bulbar dysfunction. Now, patients with Parkinson's over a period of time their speech becomes low and slow. Swallowing also gets affected. Cognitive, I'll discuss this a little later. Neuropsychiatric, a whole range of features. Fatigue, that's something that is not very different from what you would notice in your other patients. But depression and anxiety are out of proportion and again can come up years before the onset of Parkinson's. Apathy is a very unusual symptom and it's a little difficult to assess. It has its own scales. These are people who have no initiative. They're not depressed. When you ask, they're not depressed, but they just will not move or do anything. This is a complete loss of motivation. Pseudobulbar affect, we discussed last time. This is not so prominent in Parkinson's as it is in motor neuron disease, but it can. And psychosis and agitation. Ophthalmic abnormalities, an unusual entity, not so common in idiopathic, but more in PSP and so on, is eyelid opening apraxia. They seem to forget how to be able to open their eyes. Let me move on to point out the atypical OPAC plus syndromes. Now, couple of important pointers on each of them. Dementia with Lewy bodies. Now, these are patients where dementia and Parkinson's overlap. And they get very prominent visual hallucinations. And the visual hallucinations are vivid. And the patient also has some amount of insight. So the patient will kind of come up and say, look at all those people sitting there. Look at them. I mean, I remember there was this very old Irish nun who I was treating, and one of the problems that her carers had was that every night she would pick up a lathi and go bang under her bed because there are all those coolies sitting there. So she had to drive them off, and then they would be convinced. I mean, they would be convincing her that they've gone, and then she would sleep. Together with that, these patients have significant fluctuations in consciousness. So there'll be days when they'll be completely knocked out, and then and this is apart from changes in sleep-wake cycles. And these patients are extremely sensitive to neuroleptics to the point that they can actually die because of inadvertent use of haloperidol. Progressive supranuclear palsy, a very distinctive picture where somebody gets dysarthria, so their voice becomes slurred. They have speech problems, but the interesting thing is eye movements go. So when the patient comes in, I literally recognize them from the door because they're coming in like this. unblinking, straight stare. And they cannot look up and down, because they cannot look up and down. And on top of it, they have um, the pull test positive fairly early. They have false. And there's something very interesting that happens to them. They also lose the frontal circuitry, which kind of predicts our ability to balance. So I've had this patient who was not too badly off, but every time he would come in, he would literally jump onto my couch. And one day, to my horror, he actually did that, fell down, and broke his arm in front of me. So after that, a PSP coming into the clinic, I make sure that they are put up on the couch carefully. Multiple system atrophy, earlier known as the Scheidegger syndrome. They have severe and prominent autonomic dysfunction, which means orthostatic hypotension. So the pressure in the standing position, which means that you stand them up for at least 2 minutes, will drop a minimum of, and usually much more, 20 millimeters systolic and 10 millimeters diastolic. Corticobasal degeneration is a condition in which both the cortex and the basal ganglia degenerate predominantly on one side. Eventually, it moves to the other side. But when this happens, on the side which they lose, and it can be very dramatic when it happens on the left side, they will, of course, they will have posturing of the hand. I'm not sure if you can see it. Yeah, posturing of the hand, but they will also be unable to use the hand. And when you examine them, when you check out their power and so on, it looks okay, but they can't use the hand. Now, all these have a faster progression to disability, higher rates of dementia. They do respond to therapy in the beginning, but typically their lifespans are almost about 2/3 or half that of classic Parkinson's disease. But their PC needs obviously are the same as for Parkinson's. Treating Parkinson's, again, important for you to know the basic drugs that are available. These are the doses that I use. In the beginning, there's a drug called rasagiline. It's a MAO-B inhibitor, which is supposed to slow down the progression, but also does help a little bit in the early management. Anticholinergics like Pacitane, 2 milligrams TID is a full dose, but typically I would start with half BD, then go on to 1 BD, then 1 TDS. Same with amantadine, go up slowly. Levodopa, carbidopa. In an adult, you can typically, they will stay for a long period of time, 3, 4, 5 years on just 3 tablets, and then the requirement starts to go up. When it goes up, and you have to give them higher and higher doses. Earlier, we used to use levodopa, carbidopa, stronger strength, but now we use entacapone, which slows the metabolism of levodopa and allows you to give a bigger dose. You can give the same drug in a sustained release format. They are available in 125 and 250 mg. And the other drug that I use commonly is pramipexole. This is a drug that is called a dopa agonist. It's not levodopa converts in the gut, in the liver, to actual dopamine, which is taken up by the brain. Pramipexole is a dopa agonist. It doesn't convert to dopamine. Then we have new drugs which are available. Apomorphine, some of you may have seen an ad which suggested that you could bad Parkinson's patients could actually get up and walk. The unfortunate thing is that apomorphine has to be given by subcutaneous injection, and it has a short duration of action, barely about 1.5 hours. So in some patients, we do use it for infusion, but it's horrendously expensive and it has its own side effects. Just to let you know these drugs, because one of the major problems in Parkinson's is managing these drugs. And this is especially true with our workhorse drug, and that is levodopa. Now, as the disease progresses, as the basal ganglia degenerate, the dopaminergic terminals, which normally take up the dopamine that we are giving in the form of levodopa, actually degenerate. So the buffering capacity goes, and the dose effect, for the same dose, the effect swings widely. So in the initial period, you will get a smooth response with levodopa. Eventually, after some time, when you take the tablet, a little while later, the patient gets an excessive effect. We call these dyskinesia. So they are literally dancing with the drug, and then it swings right to the other end, and they are in an off state. So these are termed the motor fluctuations and the dyskinesias of levodopa and Parkinsonism. The wearing off, end of dose deterioration is something that occurs right at the end here, and you can adjust with more medicine. Some patients have problems getting a response, that's a delayed on response. In some patients, this becomes completely unpredictable. So they, rather than going into off at the end of the dose, they can just go off suddenly. And some patients can yo-yo. The on and off happens unpredictably. Then peak dose dyskinesia. These are coriform and dystonic, mainly coriform movements that come up very fast. And you will see these patients who are literally dancing away, except that they require to dance to be able to move. So very often you and the family will find it distressing to watch them, but the patient is actually okay with that. Then early morning dystonia is a slow rhythmic movement, and that actually means that the effect is lost. End of dose dystonia, off period dystonia, and so on. These are all entities that neurologists need to be aware of. But when a patient starts to develop this, usually about 5 years after starting treatment, and these happen in 30 to 80% of patients, I believe that's when the palliative care needs start to come up. What is the solution to this, especially in younger individuals? You can actually put in a neurostimulator and electrodes that go directly into the basal ganglia, into the subthalamic nucleus, the STN, or the globus pallidus interna, actually can work for a fair amount of time, alleviate disabling motor symptoms, but they of course don't help actual symptoms, meaning balance and speech. And obviously, if somebody has gone to the point of getting dementia or unstable psychiatric problems, it will not help at all, because the disorder is then obviously much beyond the basal ganglia. It has its own risks, but if it is installed, then it continues to benefit the patient throughout the course of Parkinson's disease. And we should look on this as almost as part palliative care therapy. Now, it has been said that people with Parkinson's disease die with the Parkinson's disease and not from it. The survival is about 50%, 50% survival 15 years after onset, but it can be much longer for those who are young at onset. And you can see this, for example, look at the male life expectancy after Parkinson's is diagnosed. You can see it is significantly lowered compared to the general population. Yet, as I said, very often people don't realize that somebody has died because of Parkinson's. Over 70% of PD patients die due to complications. And you can see this survival curve here. Obviously, it goes down much quicker for the Parkinson's plus syndromes here as compared to idiopathic PD. But as you can see, a good number of patients. This particular study had patients that were around about an average of 70 years old when they joined the study, so their survivals are less. But younger patients do survive longer. Once somebody reaches Hoehn-Yahr stage 5, that means wheelchair bound, then average survival is about 2 years. Common causes of death are sepsis, respiratory failure, wasting syndrome because of feeding impairment, and choking and aspiration. How do you predict mortality? And when are these patients due to be taken up for, in the US, for hospice? When the BMI drops below 18.5, or there is accelerated weight loss, or where dopaminergic medications have to be reduced because of neuropsychiatric issues, or dysphagia, or accelerated immobility. But when should PAL-care be involved? Actually, PAL-care needs, as you know, spike at the time of diagnosis. And obviously, that's not when most patients are referred. In fact, patients are not usually referred for PAL-care from Parkinson's disease. But obviously, there are other markers that occur in a patient's life. And this paper looked up. This was a semi-quantitative kind of study which looked at why uh, uh, neurologists would not be referring patients to for non-terminal palliative care. One is the pointers that came up were a feeling that they would lose the patient. The second was that they were unaware that available programs could help. And the third is they thought they could do it all. So I think there is a need for neurologists to be educated about how palliative care can help Parkinson's disease. This is because when palliative care does get involved, this is probably the only paper which looked at and which did an RCT for a multidisciplinary intervention of OPD-based palliative care. It showed significant improvement in quality of life. And this is the patient reported. When it was the caregiver reported, it seemed to continue to improve continuously. This study was over 12 months. Now, how do you assess palliative care needs? The standard tool that we have available is the Edmonton Symptom Assessment System, which is modified for Parkinson's disease, and it's freely available on the net. And it's not, I think for trained palliative care physicians, it would not be very difficult to use. Needs assessment tool PD and brief needs assessment tool PD are also available. Some specific issues that need to be addressed I'm going to cover those. Pain. Now, you can imagine that immobility would cause pain, but there is a lot more to pain in Parkinson's disease. And these are the various types of pain that they can get. Musculoskeletal, these are obviously older individuals with osteoarthritis, and muscle rigidity can actually make this worse. Then dystonia. This overlaps with the cramps that they get, and this also can improve with levodopa-therapy. Then they can get entrapment neuropathies or root pains, and you will get peripheral neuropathic pain. But the one that is not often recognized is a central or primary neuropathic pain, which occurs through the body and fluctuates with the medication cycle as a non-motor fluctuation. And this is something that neurologists often don't pick up. It may have an autonomic character with visceral sensations and doesn't seem to associate with any of the motor features of Parkinson's. Akathisia is something that is a little tricky. This is a patient who complains of discomfort because it's a subjective sensation of restlessness, and it does improve with levodopa therapy. Now, how do you figure out if the pain is related to PD? One is you have to see if there's a temporal relationship between the pain and the PD symptoms. Whether the pain changes with motor fluctuations. So does it increase when the patient is in the off phase? Does it change when you treat the off phase or get the dyskinesia under control? If any of these three is positive, then it is pain related to Parkinson's disease. And when it cannot be attributed to any other health problems directly related, but if it is, say, indirect, I mean, say, osteoarthritis aggravated by rigidity, then you call it indirectly related. And so you can understand that not only do you have to assess the burden of pain, but you also have to analyze it. Another huge problem in Parkinson is isolation. Isolation is due to limited mobility, the neuropsychiatric changes even without dementia, but more importantly, poor communication. Their voices tend to become hypophonic. They speak slowly because they do not have facial expressions. Emotional contact drops. And then there is the social stigma. So speech therapy and speech amplification devices can help. Psychotherapy can help. Antidepressants can help. But in patients who have abnormal sleep-wake cycles, this is something that I now use fairly frequently. Melatonin at bedtime, not bedtime, around about 8 p.m. and modafinil in the morning. And obviously support groups, you may not be aware, but Parkinson's disease has a very, very active support group system, and this is available almost all through the country. When do you recognize if Parkinson's is advanced? Now, you would have thought that making it stage 5 is advanced, but typically these are patients who are going through stage 3 into stage 4. And when is it definite? When they start requiring help to perform daily living activities, when motor fluctuations cause an off time greater than 25% of the day, or if they have dysphagia and so on, and obviously if they have dementia. This probably evolves around about 10 years after onset, sometimes earlier, but 10 years is a fair enough time. And obviously some of these are, all this was from a paper that tried to define advanced Parkinson's disease for purposes of trials and so on. Dementia and late Parkinson's disease is, as I said, there's a little that is mild cognitive impairment, which means only forgetting is present at onset, and about 80% will develop it before death. And so it becomes important to engage in goals of care and advanced care planning discussions early. These are the patients who have marked behavioral disturbances, psychosis, agitation, and so on. And the caretaker is most often subject to abuse in the early phases. But some Parkinson's patients are also at financial risk because dopamine is linked to the reward system. And sometimes the dopamine agonists, especially pramipexole, has been linked to increased risk taking, including to the point of gambling. So they get well controlled and then they do that. Dementia can be treated with the standard dementia drugs of rivastigmine and donepezil. In late Parkinson's disease, especially in the Parkinson's plus syndromes, there comes the question of how do you maintain feeding? And this is something that is important for us to understand. In neurological illnesses, you have two broad positions. In, say, somebody who has pure motor impairment, no cognitive impairment, the classic example would be motor neuron disease. Putting in a peg at a stage when there is no respiratory impairment will allow more prolonged survival. You can use NIV and so on and carry on longer. In somebody who's developed cognitive impairment or is severely demented, then putting in a feeding tube will not enhance survival or quality of life. And that is now pretty much a standard position in dementia. Now, if you look at Parkinsonian syndromes, you literally have to make an individual assessment of that patient, whether that patient's disability is more significantly motor or cognitive, and then advise that accordingly. Okay. Medication precautions in Parkinson's disease for palliative care professionals. Dopamine receptor blocking agents are contraindicated across the board. Parkinson's patients are extremely sensitive to that. So if you're using an antiemetic, only ondansetron. Neuroleptics, you cannot use the standard neuroleptics. A standard Serenase for delirium control, no, it cannot be given. Quetiapine is a fairly safe drug, but neurologists, especially when you're managing on a regular basis, you have to start clozapine. It requires CBC monitoring. It takes some time to be built up, but in those patients who have behavioral issues, it works very well. Even at late stages, dopaminergic therapy should not be withdrawn because patients can deteriorate very rapidly. Even though levodopa contributes to agitation and requirement drops with weight loss, even then you have to continue it. Dopa agonists may contribute to hallucinations, but if you withdraw them rapidly, you can cause a long-lasting dopamine withdrawal syndrome. So you have to actually balance behavioral adverse effects against mobility. So somebody who is completely lost mobility, well, then you may not need to bother so much about these therapies. But even then, the withdrawal has to be done very gradually and preferably under the supervision of neurologists. But whatever it is, throughout the late stages, physical therapy, active, passive, breathing exercises, all help these patients and should be continued. I'm going to stop at this point and to identify some resources on the net that I think you can look at. I'm happy to share this. I think most of you will have my email ID. If you don't, I mean, you'll be able to get it on one of the groups. Look at the first. That is a slide kit which tells you what I have told you in short about Parkinson's disease. If you are interested for the basics of PD, good revision. The second is this video of somebody, a professor, a UK professor, examining a patient with young onset Parkinson's, and it tells you what an advanced Parkinson's disease, somebody who should actually be in the purview of Parkinson's, of palliative care, looks like. And this is a very good paper that I have to thank Gayatri for giving me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roop. As always, very, very comprehensive and focusing on the important points, not just for the neurology clinicians, but especially putting it to our perspective in palliative care. There is just one question which you have partially answered in the last slide about neuroleptics to be used. So Shreya has asked what if such a person has delirium, what would be the drug of choice? And you said about quetiapine and I guess quetiapine would be the first one, and clozapine would probably reserve for the ones who have these acute psychotic symptoms on the escalation of the dopaminergic drug when they are requiring and that kind. So, but for delirium, what?
No, but I have a pretty low threshold now for starting clozapine because it takes time to build it up.
Right.
So if I see somebody who has a history of this and where I think this is going to be an issue going forward, then I start the clozapine off and titrate it up gradually while I'm still using quetiapine. Right. But that, I think you can also tell us what you would suggest.
So in my experience, I think for the delirium bit, I think it would be quetiapine because it would prime. But with the psychotic features, sometimes when you get those symptoms and they are quite intractable, I agree clozapine would be the drug of choice. So I just wanted to know, would you do it the same way about weekly CBC monitoring?
I usually ask them, initially I ask for a weekly CBC, but after about a month or so, I switch it down to a once a month and warn them that in case that patient runs into any kind of fever, then we must get a CBC immediately. Right. I know psychiatrists tend to be very worried about that, but I think that's probably overdone. Gayatri, I think, asked about an injectable. Antipsychotic. No good choices.
The only one available injectable is olanzapine, but that would not really be a good choice here because of its anticholinergic action, and there is some amount of D2 blocking also that will happen, but mainly because of the anticholinergic. And olanzapine IM, it's not really, it doesn't work that well for acute psychotic agitation in patients with, in general psychiatry with psychosis. There is some merit, but even then, people have not really found it useful. The age-old thing that we really find useful is our one and only haloperidol, which in these patients we will not be able to use.
So management of delirium here is difficult. The only good thing is that many of them, by the time they are significantly delirious, are also, their mobility is fairly limited. So, but yeah, not necessarily. So, which is why I have a low threshold for starting clozapine.
So I just want to say that most of the referrals which we get in palliative care Hello, I'm Dr. Gayatri here.
Yeah, I know.
Sorry for others. Are usually in a very advanced stage of Parkinson's disease, Parkinson's we see, where they're usually bedbound already, but they present with symptoms which are quite difficult to manage, and we often need to have, if they don't have any PEG tube, then injectable preparations. So we usually get to see patients with pain, as of course agitation, depression. Yeah, those are the common symptoms which we see, and of course the problems because of immobility like constipation, bed contractures, bed sores. Constipation, of course, is a very severe problem.
Severe, yeah.
And dealing with the side effects of this medication. So we are often at a loss as to what to do, because we don't get neurology consults easily at that point of time because they're in the homes away from the neurologist. So it becomes a challenge. I remember seeing one PSP with a lot of seizure activity for some reason. Yeah.
I don't know. I
so
think
very
going forward, I think at some stage, I know that you don't get neurologists easily, but one of the things that I've been impressed by in this whole the Zoom epidemic is how easy it is to actually do a video consult on patients like this. So I think you should establish liaisons with neurologists who will look at your patients, and I think that's something that we have to do going forward, because these patients at those stages need both a neurologist and a palliative care physician together, working together. So again, my pitch for putting these two specialties together.
Yeah.
Viru, Anil here.
Yeah.
Very often we we see a patient in whom all the medicines are stopped, either by the family, they themselves stop it because the patient continues to worsening. So sometimes we have to stop it because he's not improving at all. So what to expect when you stop the medication? Is likely to worsen the symptoms, or if there is any particular medicine that we need to continue to use till the end?
Levodopa.
The symptoms.
I would continue to use a small dose of levodopa. I mean, obviously, if depending on, you have a rough thumb rule on how much weight loss has actually occurred from the full dose, and proportionately you can reduce the load levodopa, but levodopa should go on till the end.
Till the end.
Yeah.
One question from Dr. Manjula is, how is the management of PSP different?
No, palliative care management is no different. The only thing is typically Parkinsonian patients, idiopathic PD, when I say Parkinsonian idiopathic PD, even with the onset of dementia, still have decision-making capacity. So you can discuss goals of care, you can discuss PEG tube insertion and so on with them a little early. With PSP patients, often they lose decision-making capacity. So typically, when I begin by asking them that we have to start talking about these, it will literally be the PSP patient will turn and say, talk to him. Whereas the Parkinsonian will still want to engage and be part of that decision-making. Other than that, no. There are some things that PSP patients might have, their dysphagia comes on even earlier. And so this whole PEG tube decision will come up relatively earlier as in the disease as compared to the idiopathic PD.
Right. One question from Dr. Rajeshri is, injectable risperidone not available? Long-acting preparation is available, but not sure about its safety. Olanzapine is available as mouth-melting tablets.
No.
Risperidone, I think, would be an absolute no-no.
It's as bad as haloperidol.
Yeah, as far as haloperidol, plus the long-acting is only for a long-term management of schizophrenia patients who are not compliant with oral antipsychotics. But the long-acting preparation has a lot of side effects, and even in the general psychiatry population, we wouldn't do it. Olanzapine, as we said, is about anticholinergic effects. So Gayatri wants to know any quick, simple medication resource.
For delirium.
No, for quick, simple medication resource for Parkinson's. Is that what you want, Gayatri?
She herself gave me that article.
No, Savita. Acha.
Yeah.
And Savita has sent a link to a useful article, so we can copy that.
Okay. So if anybody wants papers or whatever, I'm happy to share whatever I have. And good.
So Savita, you wanted to know about PC in Parkinson's.
Savita also.
No, thank you.
You wanted to give that article as a reference for PC in Parkinson's.
Yes.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay.
Which one is that?
The one that she has.
Yeah, I know. I'm just copying it right now before it gets lost.
Yeah. Any other questions? I had one actually. Is that we in psychiatry we see a lot times that depression is quite common in Parkinson's, and I have seen a few patients with depression, especially in the PSPs, who have been quite difficult to manage actually. So, what is your experience, and what antidepressants do you use?
I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it's straightforward escitalopram and mirtazapine. I mean, when it goes beyond that, it's a psychiatry reference for me.
And any particular subtype that you see it more commonly in?
Idiopathic PD.
Idiopathic, you see it more commonly.
Yeah, idiopathic PD.
Okay, Rajeshri was talking about the availability and not about the use in PD. Thank you, Rajeshri. And Gayatri would want a case-based discussion at some point of time, which others have said about useful. And Gayatri has asked about vocalization management.
So the speech therapists usually are able to help them project their voices better and so on. So usually my patients with significant issues, I ask them to at least have one speech therapy session every week. In addition, the other trick I use when patients get really badly stuck, I use it with all these patients, is tell them that before they come into the consulting room, they must put down whatever questions they have, so that they're not stuck trying to ask them at that minute.
So I also saw a very peculiar situation, where they make a lot of noise, like that, and it's very disturbing too.
That's PSP. That's often with PSP, and the other is stridor in MSA. They have huge stridor, laryngeal stridor. And PSPs, for some reason, and it's not exactly understood. There was this patient of mine who would go, non-stop through the night. The family was just being driven berserk by that. I mean, and this happens in PSP very often. Again, it's not really. It's a part of the dementia, because when spoken to, they actually stop doing it.
And Rajeshri has said that gait training too might help to an extent, apart from the vocalization.
So physiotherapy, you have to start.
Physical therapies.
Yeah.
Right.
Next time, I hope to make it. I'll send out fresh invites, because we'll make it. This is still webinar mode. We'll change it to meeting mode so that everybody can show up. You don't have to do it manually.
Yeah. So thank you everybody for joining us on the webinar, and it's good experience and sharing and plus learning, because we know bits about that neurology, but it helps to get Roop tell us about the whole picture. And I really like that you take that bit of theory, because I think it's important to understand the theory because before we can clinically apply it. So thank you very much, Roop, and thanks everyone who have joined us, Anil and Rajeshri and Gayatri and Savita and all my students. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And see you next Wednesday. Bye.
Bye. Good night.